Hi. All right. So today we are starting a unit on the Cold War. The Cold War is probably my favorite thing to talk about. But before we get started into the chapter, I want to talk a little bit about what the world looks like before and after the Second World War, which is going to lead us into the Cold War. So what I have right here is a little diagram of the international system prior to the Second World War. So this is after the First World War and during the Great Depression. The Great Depression is a global phenomenon, and all countries have taken a kind of economic blow. So we do have some that are doing better than others. The US, while hit very hard by the Great Depression, is in a better position than some other countries are, but we've intentionally separated ourselves. After the First World War, we declined to join the League of Nations, and so we've kind of barred ourselves from everyone else. That's why I have that kind of bar drawn here. And even in the 1930s, as things are kind of kicking off and we're getting closer to the outbreak of the Second World War, Congress passes those neutrality acts, starting in 1935. And so the US has definitely put up a metaphorical wall between ourselves and the rest of the world. Major powers in Europe, places like Britain and France, are both probably about on par with the United States. They've been hit hard by the Depression as well, but they're holding on to their dominance in Europe in particular, and particularly following the First World War, where they kind of got to make the rules. Over in Asia, Japan is doing relatively well. Again, they have been hit by the Depression, but they are doing relatively well, and Japan is working on acquiring even more power and influence, particularly in the Pacific. The Japanese acquired a number of Pacific islands during the First World War that belonged to Germany, and they were allowed to keep them because Japan fought with the UK and France and the US and all that during the First World War. And so they took over a lot of Pacific islands that Germany owned at the time, and they were allowed to keep them. They also, over the course of the 20s and 30s, moved in and took over Korea and large parts of China, despite being members of the League of Nations and being told, please don't do this, and various treaty agreements. Japan is attempting to build a kind of military empire. So that's why they've got this little upward arrow. The Soviets pulled out of the First World War early, if you'll recall, when the revolution took place. And so they've been in the midst of nation building, essentially, over this period. They're consolidating their power and they're building. They were also, of course, hit by the Depression, but they're also coming up. They are not as well off as some of the older, more established powers like Britain or France, but they are up and coming. Probably the biggest up and coming power in Europe, though, particularly in the 30s and particularly in the later part of the 30s, is Germany. Germany is, of course, hit extremely hard, first by the loss in the First World War and the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, but then also the Depression, because Germany's government, the Weimar Republic, which is installed after the First World War, is essentially being propped up by the US for the most part. It's this sort of interesting cycle of loans and reparations or payments, because if you'll recall, Germany owes billions of dollars in reparations to mainly Britain and France. What they are doing in order to pay those reparations is they're taking loans from the United States. So the US is loaning money to Germany. Germany is using that money to pay reparations payments to Britain and France. And then Britain and France are using the reparations payments to make payments on loans that they took from the United States. So all of that money is basically America's money. We go and cycle it through a bunch of other people's hands and then end up back with it ourselves. It's actually fairly nonsensical. But when the Depression hits in late 1930, 1931, gets really serious, the US stops loaning money to Germany. Germany defaults on its reparations payments. The UK and France default on their loan payments, and everybody's a little bit worse off. This has put Germany in a desperate situation, and desperate enough to look to the rhetoric and stuff coming from Hitler and the Nazi Party. So they rise to power, and they immediately start rebuilding Germany, particularly the German military. And so that's why they've got this big arrow. And it's even surpassing the sort of old dominant powers of Britain and France, because at the outbreak of the Second World War, Germany had been preparing for years to start this war. And France is really quickly overrun by the German military, and Britain is holding on by its teeth in the Battle of Britain. They were vastly unprepared for this war. And so that's why that arrow is actually going a little bit further up. Japan is as well. But when we look at this system, everybody is kind of on an almost even keel. When we look at the system going into the Second World War. Coming out of the Second World War, we have an entirely different situation. So the Second World War completely upended the international system and the shape of the international system. Really, if you look at it, out of the Second World War, we have two dominant superpowers. The United States comes out of the war relatively well off, fairly unscathed. And when we talk about power and dominance in the international system, the US is the only nation to have the atomic bomb. And that definitely tilts the power balance in our favor, particularly. The Soviet Union is also a dominant superpower because they control most of Europe. Whereas the United States has the bomb, the Soviet Union has millions of men under arms. They have the largest and probably most formidable army as far as manpower at this time. And pretty soon as well, they are going to acquire the bomb, which will kick off that arms race, which is going to be the subject of this unit, or a subject in this unit. These old European powers are no longer the dominant force in international politics, and so they kind of take a back seat to the superpowers. And we see an interesting kind of flip in international relations. So when the US first arrived on the scene back in the 18th century and the 19th century, the early 19th century, we look at something like the War of 1812, the US made the argument that we should be allowed to, freedom of the seas and free trade and stuff like that. We seem to espouse that argument a lot when other countries go to war. And Britain and France, who were the big superpowers of the world, if we're going to talk in those terms, in the early 19th century, were like, no, that's not how the system works. Big powers fight and small powers pick a side. And that role is kind of flipped now in the mid 20th century. The big powers, the US and the Soviet Union, are fighting, and the smaller powers have to pick a side. And so Britain and France find themselves relegated to secondary power status in that sense. Obviously, the major losers of the Second World War were Japan and Germany, and they are going to be hit hard by the war. However, the Cold War is going to play a role in the evolution of these countries. So because we end up sort of devolving into this ideological Cold War, countries that are influenced by the United States, which will be Japan and West Germany, will get a lot of US investment, economic investment, monetary investment, and a lot of help as far as rebuilding. And so they recover relatively quickly. So West Germany will very quickly recover and be on par with secondary powers now, Britain and France, and Japan as well. It will get rebuilt. It will get a new constitutional government a la the United States. It will get a sort of economic renaissance, and it will prosper and again move up relatively quickly. Germany is divided in half, and again, that's something I'll talk more about when we get into my lectures proper. But East Germany, which is controlled by the Soviets, will not be quite so prosperous. It's essentially going to be a Soviet satellite state, and it's going to stay down here. China will also be hit relatively hard by the war. However, they will regain the territory that they lost to Japan. And in their communist revolution, and because they will get a lot of support from the Soviet Union, they will actually get a kind of growth spurt as well and start growing drastically to be on par with some of these secondary powers, and perhaps even surpass some of the secondary powers as well when we look at it. Why, you might ask, are East Germany and China, both of whom are Soviet influenced countries, why is East Germany stagnant whereas China is growing? And that's because they play different roles with one another. China is potentially a huge Soviet ally with significant manpower of its own, as well as separate or sort of similar politics in that sense. East Germany is playing a different role to China. It's not seen by the Soviets as a sovereign, separate entity that could be an ally. It's essentially being used as a buffer. And again, that's something that I'll touch on more in the lecture. But this is the world system that we're talking about when we talk about the Cold War. Two very dominant superpowers, and everybody else just kind of forced to choose sides. So with that information, let's get into the chapters.